Margaret of Valois, better known as Queen Margot. You've probably encountered her as a character of passion and scandal, immortalized in books and films that focus only on her lovers. But Margaret was far more than a woman chasing passion. She was a rebel. A woman her own family, and especially her own mother, tried again and again to break and failed. She survived beatings, a forced marriage, nearly 20 years of captivity. And in the end, she found freedom and became the last surviving member of the Valois dynasty. This is the story of how a pawn in her family's game became a true queen. Have you ever had the thought that in the past, the best card you could possibly draw was being born into a royal family? Surely that's better than being the child of a servant or a peasant. But I'm not sure Margaret of Valois would have agreed with that idea. She was born in 1553 into the family of the French king Henry II of France and Catherine de' Medici. Among her many siblings, 10 in total, Margaret stood out from infancy for her strong health. While most of the royal children were frail and sickly, she was resilient and full of life. And this was something her mother would later complain about more than once, saying it would have been better if her sons had inherited such strength, rather than what she saw as a troublesome and willful daughter. Little Margaret was lively, sharp, with a light temperament and piercing eyes. She was her father's favourite. She remembered sitting on his knees while he joked with her, and she described those moments with tenderness in her memoirs. But in those warm childhood memories, her mother was nowhere to be found. What Margaret remembered most about her upbringing under her mother was this: "So strictly brought up under the Queen my mother, that I scarcely durst speak before her, and if she chanced to turn her eyes towards me I trembled, for fear that I had done something to displease her." But does that mean Catherine de' Medici was a terrible mother from the very beginning? I don't have a definitive answer, because we have to remember that a significant part of the royal children's upbringing was influenced by her husband's powerful mistress, Diane de Poitiers, a woman who had, in many ways, pushed Catherine aside in her own household. That dynamic alone could have left deep scars. And we should also consider Catherine's own childhood. Her parents died when she was still an infant. She grew up moving from one household to another, passed between relatives, never truly rooted anywhere. It's possible she simply never learned how to build a healthy mother-child bond. You can't always give what you were never given. At the age of 6, Margaret first felt the breath of death, a presence that would follow her family relentlessly. Her father, King Henry II of France, died after a tragic accident during a jousting tournament. Her older brother, Francis II of France, ascended the throne, and died just a year later, at only 16. By the time Margaret was 15, she had already witnessed the deaths of 5 of her brothers and sisters. What she did not yet know was that she would one day become the sole surviving member of the Valois dynasty. By her teenage years, Margaret had grown into a true beauty. She strongly resembled Catherine de' Medici, who, ironically, had not been considered beautiful in her own youth. But Margaret's porcelain skin and perfectly balanced features created around her an aura of ideal beauty. Ambassadors would write that not to see Margaret of Valois at the French court was like being in France and not seeing Paris. Yet Margaret was not only beautiful, she was intelligent and well-educated. She was the only one among her siblings to master Latin. Although she grew up alongside her sisters and Mary Stuart, her closest bonds were formed with her brothers. As she matured, rumours began to circulate that this affection was not entirely innocent, that it was more intimate than sibling love. But there's no real proof behind these rumours. Most likely they were spread to damage the royal family's image. And Catherine, as we know, had plenty of enemies ready to twist any story against her. We also have to remember that the time and the situation in which Margaret grew up were extremely difficult for her family. Catherine was fighting desperately to hold on to power and even used her ladies-in-waiting to keep influential men under control, which, of course, contributed to their rather scandalous reputation surrounding her daughters. So even though Margaret grew up surrounded by intrigue and moral corruption, she herself remained untouched by it. She felt especially close to her brother Henry, who happened to be Catherine's favourite. But Henry was already a skilled manipulator. Even then, he viewed his sister not as a confidant, but as a useful piece on the chessboard of court politics. He convinced her to gain their mother's trust, and secretly report back to him about her plans. And the naive Margaret agreed without hesitation. What she did not yet know was that her brother would repay her loyalty not with gratitude, but with betrayal. In 1570, Margaret allowed herself a freedom that was simply not permitted for a girl of her rank. She fell in love with the ambitious and dangerously charismatic Henry I, Duke of Guise. He was only 18, already known as a heartbreaker, famous for his romantic entanglements. One of Margaret's letters to him fell into the hands of her family. What truly happened behind the closed doors of palace chambers, we cannot know for certain. Margaret denied any physical relationship with him until the end of her life, although she did continue corresponding with him. Henry, however, had his own grievances against Guise. He persuaded their mother and their older brother, King Charles IX of France, that Margaret was secretly planning to marry him, a claim that triggered a furious reaction. None of Catherine de' Medici's children were allowed to defy her or arrange their own destinies without her approval. Catherine had paid too high a price to preserve the dynasty, and she tolerated no independence. According to one ambassador's account, her mother and brother burst into Margaret's chambers in the middle of the night and beat her, tearing her clothes from her body. The assault was so violent that Catherine reportedly spent nearly an hour afterward attempting to restore her daughter's appearance. From that moment on, despite Margaret's protests of innocence, she became the black sheep in her mother's eyes. But no matter what had happened, Margaret was still a valuable piece on her mother's chessboard. Like every other member of the family, she was expected to serve Catherine's interests, and part of that service meant marriage. Catherine attempted to arrange several matches for her daughter, with the King of Portugal and with a Spanish prince. But the reputation of Margaret's family, and perhaps Margaret herself, made her a less desirable bride than one might expect. In the end, a husband was chosen, Henry of Navarre, a leader of the Huguenots as French Protestants were called. Navarre was a small kingdom on the border with France. Henry's greatest advantage was not wealth or territory, but blood. He carried the blood of French kings and held a legitimate claim to the throne after Catherine's sons, and politically this marriage could serve as a step toward religious peace. Margaret and Henry were close in age, and objectively, Henry was a far better option than the half-mad Spanish prince Don Carlos, who had once been proposed as her husband. But the young couple did not like each other. Henry was not particularly handsome, and Margaret was clearly unimpressed with the religious views of her future husband. She was a devoted and sincere Catholic. On the night before the wedding, she knelt before her mother and begged to be released from the marriage. But Catherine did not believe in feelings. She was far too pragmatic to ever truly understand her daughter's heart. She threatened Margaret, saying that if she refused, she would make her the most miserable woman in France, whatever that might mean. And in that moment, Margaret realised, as she later wrote, "I had no will but her own." On the wedding day, August 18th, 1572, when Margaret stood at the altar and was asked whether she consented to the marriage, she did not answer. She simply stared straight ahead. Then, her brother Henry stepped forward and physically pushed her head down so that it appeared as a nod of agreement. The Archbishop accepted this as her response. You have to admit, this sounds less like a fairy tale wedding and more like something out of a nightmare. But the real nightmare was still ahead, and after what followed, even the bloodiest scenes from Game of Thrones would seem like a bedtime story. Paris, filled with Huguenots and Catholics, celebrated the royal wedding for nearly a week. It was meant to symbolise a new alliance, a long-awaited reconciliation. Instead, it became one of the most brutal massacres in French history. On the night of August 23rd to 24th, by order of King Charles IX of France and with the silent consent of Catherine de' Medici, mass killings of Huguenots began. The violence lasted for days. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 5,000 and 30,000 people were murdered. But, in the very moment the city erupted into slaughter, a severely wounded Huguenot burst into Margaret's chamber, pursued by armed men. And Margaret did something extraordinary. She threw herself between the stranger and his attackers, refusing to let them kill him. She hid several people in her rooms. To me, that says a great deal about her character. Even amid religious hatred, she did not wish death upon anyone. And she did not only save strangers, she also saved her husband, unwanted though he may have been, openly defying her mother. Catherine de' Medici asked her daughter a crucial question. Had the marriage been consummated? Margaret immediately understood why. Her mother wanted grounds to annul the union. As Margaret later wrote, "I suspected that the intention of separating me from my husband was meant to cause him some harm." So she answered yes. The marriage had been consummated. She carried guilt for the thousands who had come to Paris as guests to what was now a blood-soaked wedding. And though she did not love Henry, she would not hand him over to the same fate. Henry's life, and eventually his crown, were preserved, though for the moment he became a hostage of the Valois court and, under pressure, soon converted to Catholicism. You would think that such courage, saving her husband's life, might have earned Margaret at least some loyalty in return. But Henry trusted no one from the Valois family, not Catherine de' Medici, not Margaret. He never truly understood how many times she had quietly protected him from her own family. So Henry became a man generous with affection to everyone except his wife. Over the course of his life, he had around 50 mistresses. He made no effort to hide them at court, placing Margaret in a deeply humiliating position, much like the one her own mother had once endured, when the Queen holds less influence and fewer privileges than the King's favourite. And yet history, helped by Alexandre Dumas, branded Margaret as the libertine. She simply allowed herself what men had always allowed themselves, the right to love. At 19, still dreaming of love and passion, Margaret met Joseph de la Mole, a man 20 years her senior, charming, experienced, and close to her younger brother Francois. A passionate affair began, but this love story too ended in tragedy. Her younger brother became involved in a plot against their older brother. Catherine could not punish her own son, so the blame fell on La Mole. In his chamber, a wax figurine was discovered. He was accused of attempting to use magic to harm the king. Catherine ordered his execution. Before his death, he endured horrific torture, and according to accounts, the only name on his lips was Margaret. One contemporary wrote that, on the night after his execution, Margaret secretly left the palace, went to the place of his death, and arranged for his body to be properly buried, carrying his severed head to a chapel. A darker legend claimed she preserved his head in a jewelled casket for the rest of her life. Whether myth or truth, her heart was shattered once again. And this was only one of many passionate romances that would fuel her reputation and her mother's fury. Catherine, who had endured her own husband's infidelities while remaining outwardly faithful, openly condemned her daughter's romantic nature. Her brother, Henry, now King Henry III of France, did the same. At one point, they even expelled Margaret from the French court, suspecting her of being pregnant by a lover. Her carriage was humiliatingly searched for the body of a supposed infant, a public disgrace. Catherine initially tried to repair Margaret's marriage, urging Henry to behave like a proper husband, but over time it became clear this union was a complete disaster. There were no children, and there was no religious peace. Now Catherine began preparing for something unthinkable, Henry's divorce. She even started considering a new bride for him, her own granddaughter. But what Catherine de' Medici failed to realise was this: Margaret was the very apple that had not fallen far from the tree. She may not have been her mother's favourite child, but she was undeniably her daughter, and without even intending to, Catherine had raised her own opposition at court. What she did was unprecedented for a woman of her time. She joined the Catholic League, openly opposing both her brother and her husband, and seized the city of Agen, ruling it independently under her own authority. Technically, Agen was already hers as a part of her dowry, but she fortified the city, and prepared to defend it against her own family's troops if necessary. But Margaret's plan did not succeed. Her supporters never came to her aid, and she was taken by her own family and placed under house arrest. Her once beloved brother Henry even wrote that it would have been better for everyone if Margaret had simply died. Margaret spent nearly 18 years in the castle of Ussen. Imprisonment may sound dramatic. She was allowed some movement, maintained a social circle, even had romantic relationships. But those 18 years were not wasted. Her greatest achievement during that time was writing her memoirs. Those memoirs, written in beautiful, vivid language, became the foundation for this very video. I truly recommend reading them. And if you're especially interested in the mother-daughter dynamic, I also recommend the book Rival Queens, which I used as one of my key sources. Catherine was so enraged that her daughter had dared to choose herself over the family that she never saw Margaret again. On her deathbed, she even disinherited her. Soon after her mother's death, her brother, Henry III of France, was assassinated. Margaret became the last surviving member of the once great Valois dynasty and Queen of France. A queen, still sitting in confinement. To finally regain her freedom, she had to strike a deal with her husband and agree to the annulment of their marriage, but on very favourable terms. Although she was no longer his wife, she officially retained the title of Queen of France, secured financial independence, and preserved her dignity. She definitely had the talent of a diplomat. In the end, France had two queens at the same time. The final years of Margaret's life were perhaps her happiest, because at last she had something she had never truly possessed before: freedom. Freedom from her mother's control, from her brothers, even from her husband. She devoted herself to the arts, to literature, to charity, and, quite remarkably, she showed kindness toward her former husband's newborn son, born from his new marriage to Marie de Medici. Margaret left all her property to that child, the future Louis XIII of France. And to me, that says everything. She did not grow bitter, she did not seek revenge. Instead, she chose cooperation. She built warm, respectful relations with the new royal family of her former husband, and perhaps that was her greatest victory of all. And when Catherine de Medici died, France, exhausted and drowning in religious wars, barely paused. But when Margaret passed away at the age of 62, all of Paris mourned her. Even her former husband's second wife said of her, "She was deeply regretted." Margaret of Valois may have been cast as a pawn, in her family and on the grand chessboard of history, but throughout her life she fought for one thing: freedom. To her family, and especially to her mother, Margaret was often a problem, a scandal, a source of conflict. But in reality, she was one of the brightest representatives of her dynasty, and just as much of a rebel as the mother she resembled so strongly. Did Margaret of Valois win your heart the way she won mine? If you have any interesting additions to her biography, feel free to share them in the comments. See you in the next video.